when the smartest girl in class finally snapped and exposed her team's lies, only for the professor to whisper 4 words that left everyone in shock. Being the professor's teaching assistant meant I had a front row seat to watch the slowest train wreck in academic history unfold over the entire semester. The girl who finally snapped was named Ella, and she was probably the smartest person in that business communications class, which made what happened even worse. Ella was the type of student professors dream about because she actually cared about learning, instead of just getting the grade. She always sat in the 3rd row, center, took notes on actual paper, and asked questions that made Professor Stewart smile and launch into 20-minute explanations. When he assigned the semester group project worth 40% of everyone's final grade, Ella volunteered to be group leader without anyone asking. The group she got randomly assigned was an absolute disaster from day one, and I knew it because I had access to all their submitted assignments. There was Gabe, who hadn't turned in a single homework on time, Isabel, who spent every class shopping on her laptop, Hudson, who showed up maybe once every 2 weeks, and another girl failing 3 other classes. Ella didn't know any of this when she walked up to them after class with a smile, already talking about meeting times. Ella started coming to my office hours every week, asking for feedback on the project, and that's how I learned the group was even worse than I'd expected. She'd show me completed work and casually mention she was still waiting for Gabe's section or that Isabel promised to do financial projections but hadn't started. At first, she made excuses for them, saying Gabe had football practice, even though I knew he'd been cut from the team last year. By midterm, Ella stopped making excuses and just looked exhausted, showing me her progress. She'd completed the entire market research section, written the competitive analysis, created all financial projections, and designed the PowerPoint slides completely alone. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I saw her sitting in the same library study room, through the glass walls, always by herself with her laptop and color-coded notebooks spread across the table. Once I walked by and heard her leaving a voicemail about meeting times, her voice still somehow cheerful. Nobody except Ella showed up to the practice presentation session, and Professor Stewart noticed immediately because the rest of her group had attended the previous class 2 days earlier. Ella delivered the entire 20-minute presentation by herself, switching between parts that were supposed to be delivered by different team members, doing it flawlessly, even though her hands were shaking. Professor Stewart gave her feedback about minor improvements and asked where her team was, and Ella said they must have gotten confused about the date. After class, I heard her make a phone call, practically begging someone to show up for the final presentation. She said she'd done literally everything for the project and wasn't asking them to help anymore. She just needed them to show up and stand next to her for 20 minutes so they wouldn't lose points for missing team members. She even said she'd put their names on specific slides, so all they had to do was stand there. The morning of the final presentations, Ella showed up wearing a professional blazer with printed copies of the report for everyone. She kept checking her phone and looking at the door, and I watched her face go from hopeful to panicked to completely blank as minutes ticked by and Professor Stewart called their group. Ella walked to the front alone, took a deep breath and said, "My group members couldn't make it today, so I'll be presenting our marketing analysis for Nike's expansion into sustainable athletic wear by myself." She gave another flawless presentation. After she finished answering questions, Professor Stewart started writing in his grade book and announced to the class that her group would receive the automatic letter grade deduction as stated in the syllabus. That's when Ella completely lost it and said, "Are you seriously going to give me the same grade as them when I'm the only one who bothered to show up?" The entire classroom went silent, and Professor Stewart told everyone to leave immediately except Ella and me. Ella sat across from his desk, and something in her face changed completely, like watching someone finally decide they were done being nice. "You want to know why my group didn't show up?" she said in a voice I'd never heard before. "Because they're all shameless parasites who've been using me this entire semester, and I'm done covering for them." Professor Stewart started saying something about professionalism, but Ella cut him off and pulled out her phone. "Gabe told me he had football practice every day, but he got cut last year and spends afternoons getting high in his dorm," she said, scrolling through messages. "Here's the one time he responded, telling me to chill out because his dad would make sure everyone passed anyway." She kept going, her voice getting louder, showing screenshot after screenshot of ignored messages, empty Google Drive logs, and emails where she begged for just 1 hour of help. Isabel hasn't looked at the project once. Hudson showed up to maybe 3 classes all semester, and they all knew I'd do everything because I actually care about my future. She stood up and slammed her phone on his desk, making Professor Stewart actually flinch. "I want them all to fail," Ella said. "Every single one deserves zeros, especially Gabe, who texted me last night saying I should be grateful for the opportunity to prove myself." Professor Stewart looked at the evidence for about 30 seconds, then leaned back and stared at Ella with an expression I'd never seen before. "Gabe is my son," he said in a completely flat voice that made the room feel like all the air had been sucked out. The silence that followed those 4 words felt like it stretched for hours, though it was probably only seconds. I stood frozen by the door, my hand still on the handle from when Professor Stewart had told everyone else to leave. Ella's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to form words but couldn't find any that made sense. Her face went through so many expressions, confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like she'd been punched in the stomach. Professor Stewart's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone on the desk, knocking over a pen holder that scattered markers across the floor. Nobody moved to pick them up. "You knew," Ella finally whispered, so quiet I almost didn't hear it, then louder, her voice getting stronger with each word. "You knew your son was in my group this whole time, and you never said anything." Professor Stewart started to speak, something about university policy and random assignments, but Ella let out a bitter laugh that didn't sound anything like her. I pulled out my phone without really thinking about it and started recording. Something in my gut told me I needed proof of whatever was about to happen. "This doesn't change the grading policy," Professor Stewart said, but his voice cracked on the word policy, and he had to clear his throat. "The rules apply to everyone equally." "Equally?" Ella scrolled through her phone with shaking fingers. "Let me read you something Gabe sent me 3 weeks ago." She held up the screen, though we were too far to see it. "Don't worry so much about the grade, my dad will handle it. It's your son telling me not to worry because you'd handle it." The door suddenly opened, and 2 students poked their heads in, probably wondering why the hallway was so quiet. Professor Stewart's face turned red, and he yelled at them to get out, louder than I'd ever heard him. They scrambled away, and I heard their footsteps running down the hall. Ella grabbed her bag from the floor, shoving her laptop inside without closing it properly. She walked to the door where I was still standing, and when she looked at me, her eyes were bright with unshed tears and anger. "This isn't over," she said to me, not even looking back at Professor Stewart. I nodded because we both knew I'd seen everything, heard everything. She pushed past me into the hallway. Professor Stewart called my name, but I pretended not to hear and followed Ella out. I found her about 20 feet down the hall, leaning against the wall with her eyes closed, taking deep breaths like she'd just run a marathon. Her professional blazer from the presentation was wrinkled now from where she'd been clutching it. "Sophie," she said when she heard my footsteps, "will you back me up if I report this? I need someone who saw what happened in there." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text. Professor Stewart's name lit up the screen. "My office now." Ella saw it too. "Don't go alone," she said. But I went anyway because I was still his TA and technically worked for him. 10 minutes later, I sat in his cramped office while he closed the door and pulled the blinds shut. The office smelled like old coffee and desperation. "Sophie, you're smart," he started, sitting on the edge of his desk instead of behind it, trying to look casual, but his leg was bouncing. "You know how these things can be misunderstood. Ella's upset, which I understand, but she's overreacting." He paused, rubbing his face with both hands. "Gabe has difficulties, ADHD, anxiety, you name it. This could destroy his future, Sophie. One bad grade, sure, but expulsion? That follows you forever." Then he said something that made my stomach turn. "I'm looking for a research assistant next semester, a paid position that looks great on grad school applications. I think you'd be perfect for it." The offer hung in the air between us. We both knew what he was really saying. Take the job, forget what you saw. I told him I needed to think about it and got out of there as fast as I could, feeling like I needed a shower. I found Ella in the library an hour later, in the same study room where she'd spent all those Tuesday and Thursday nights alone. There's something really odd about Professor Stewart waiting until the very end to drop that bombshell about Gabe being his son. Did he honestly think Ella would never find out? She had her laptop open to the student handbook, specifically the section on academic integrity violations. "How did it go with Stewart?" she asked without looking up. I pulled out my phone and showed her the email he'd sent right after I left his office, formally offering me the research position with a salary that was way more than any TA made. Her eyes went wide, and she immediately took a screenshot. "That's a bribe," she said, not even making it a question. "He's trying to buy your silence with a job." She was already pulling up the university's ethics policies, adding the screenshot to a folder on her desktop labeled Evidence. The folder already had dozens of files in it. By 5:30, we were sitting in a small office in the Student Services building with Grace Chavez, a tired-looking senior who worked part-time helping students with academic complaints. She kept stopping us to make sure she understood correctly. Wait, Grace said for the third time, holding up her hand. Professor Stewart's son was in the group, his actual son, and he knew this the whole time? Gabe Stewart, Ella confirmed, showing her the class roster, randomly assigned, supposedly. Grace leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. This is big. This is really, really big. She picked up her phone. I need to call my supervisor. Don't go anywhere. That evening, around 8:30, my phone rang. It was Ella, and I could hear banging in the background. Gabe's at my door, she said, and I could hear the fear under her steady voice. He's drunk or something. He keeps yelling that I'm ruining everything. Through the phone, I heard Gabe's voice, muffled but angry. Open the door, Ella. We need to talk about this. You're destroying my dad's career over nothing. Don't open it, I told her, already grabbing my keys. Call campus security. I'm coming over. Already calling them on my other phone, she said. I'm recording this too. I stayed on the line while she dealt with security, hearing Gabe get escorted away, still yelling about how Ella didn't understand what she was doing to his family. By the next morning, the story had exploded across campus group chats. Someone in our class, who turned out to be Aisha Weiss, had posted about seeing Gabe get removed from Ella's dorm by security. The story got more dramatic with each share. By noon, everyone was talking about the professor who tried to fail a student for exposing his son. Professor Stewart's morning class was half empty. I heard from another TA that he'd barely managed to teach, stumbling over his words and dismissing class 20 minutes early. That afternoon, Dean Nathan Shaw called us all into a conference room. Me, Ella, Professor Stewart, and a woman from the faculty union who sat next to him, taking notes on everything. The room was too small for the tension in it. Let's be clear about why we're here, Dean Shaw started. But Professor Stewart's union representative interrupted. This meeting is procedurally irregular. My client hasn't been formally notified of any complaints. Your client tried to bribe a student employee, Ella said calmly, sliding a printed copy of the email across the table, after his son harassed me at my dorm last night. Professor Stewart's face went pale. The union rep started to speak again, but Dean Shaw held up his hand. Miss Snyder, please walk me through the semester from the beginning. For the next hour, Ella laid out everything, every ignored message, every empty group meeting. Every time she'd asked for help, she had timestamps, screenshots, even security footage from the library showing her working alone week after week. I confirmed every detail I'd witnessed, my voice steady even though my hands were sweating. 3 days later, Isabel and Hudson suddenly sent Ella emails claiming they had helped with the project, and that she was lying about doing it alone. The emails arrived 4 minutes apart and used suspiciously similar wording. They can't even cheat right, Ella said, forwarding both to Grace with a single word. Really? The next day, Dean Shaw asked me to write out everything I'd witnessed. I sat in a quiet room for 3 hours, filling 12 pages with every detail I could remember, seeing Ella alone in the library every week, the empty practice presentation, Professor Stewart's bribe attempt. My hand cramped from writing so much. By day 5, Professor Stewart was placed on administrative leave while they investigated. We got a substitute teacher who looked confused when the entire class went silent as Gabe walked in late. He slouched to a back corner seat, avoiding everyone's eyes. Ella sat in her usual spot, 3rd row, center, taking notes like nothing had changed. After class, Gabe cornered me by the vending machines. You're destroying my dad's career over some stupid project, he said, getting close enough that I could smell energy drink on his breath. You know that, right? 30 years of teaching gone because you couldn't mind your own business. I'm just telling the truth, I said, trying to step around him. He moved to block me. The truth? The truth is that Ella is a control freak who wouldn't let anyone help. Dude, stop! Dylan Bell appeared from nowhere, pulling Gabe back by his shoulder. You're making it worse. You're literally proving their point right now. Gabe shrugged him off but backed away, muttering something about how we'd regret this. A week in, the review board scheduled a formal hearing. Ella threw herself into preparation with the same intensity she'd shown on the project. She bought a box of colored tabs and created a timeline of evidence that covered her entire desk. Every email was printed, every text screenshot organized by date, every piece of work she'd done categorized and labeled. Grace stopped by to check on her and whistled low. I've been doing this for 2 years and I've never seen a student this prepared. I only get one shot at this, Ella said, not looking up from her filing system. The next day, something unexpected happened. Other students started coming forward with their own stories about Professor Stewart. Aisha Weiss showed emails where grades had been changed without explanation. A former student sent proof that his final exam score jumped 40 points after his parents donated to the department. "This is bigger than just my project," Ella said, reading through the messages people were sending her. "He's been doing this for years." The investigation expanded beyond just our class. Suddenly, there were lawyers involved, real ones from the university's legal department, who sent emails marked confidential and privileged. Everyone started being very careful about what they said and wrote. 10 days after everything started, Ella finally called her parents. I sat with her while she did it, watching her pace around her dorm room. "Mom, I need to tell you something," she started. Then the whole story poured out. I could hear her mother's voice getting louder through the phone, not angry at Ella, but furious about the situation. Her parents drove 3 hours that same night. When they arrived, her mom spread all of Ella's evidence across the dorm lounge table, reading through everything with the focused attention of someone who'd worked in HR for 20 years. "This is clear academic misconduct," her mother said. "And that email about the research position? That's attempted bribery." Her father, a quiet man who hadn't said much, just pulled Ella into a hug. That's when she finally cried, really cried, for the first time since this all started. Not the angry tears from before, but exhausted, relieved sobs. The next night, I got an anonymous email with screenshots from Gabe's Instagram stories going back months. There he was, bragging about not reading the textbook, joking about Ella being his personal secretary, posting pictures of himself at parties on nights when group meetings were scheduled. I forwarded everything to Ella. "Add it to the pile," she said. But I saw her save everything carefully in her evidence folder. 2 days before the hearing, the school administration went into full damage control mode. Official communications replaced normal conversations. Every email now had legal disclaimers at the bottom. Grace warned us that things were about to get complicated. "Professor Stewart hired his own lawyer," she told us. "A good one. This isn't going to be easy." The morning of the hearing, Ella dressed in the same professional blazer she'd worn for the presentation. But this time her hands weren't shaking. We walked into a conference room that had been set up like a courtroom, with a 5-member review board at a long table facing rows of chairs. Gabe sat in the back row with his mother, who kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Dylan Bell was there too, looking uncomfortable. Isabel sat with her parents, whispering urgently. Hudson, predictably, was nowhere to be seen. For 2 hours, Ella presented her case. She never raised her voice, never lost her composure, even when Gabe actually smirked at something she said. She walked the board through every single piece of evidence, every timestamp, every unanswered email. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she concluded. "I'm asking for fair treatment. I did the work. They didn't. Their grades should reflect that." When it was Professor Stewart's turn, he claimed he had no idea Gabe was struggling. He said he treated all students equally, that he'd never shown favoritism. His lawyer kept objecting to questions, saying they weren't relevant. I raised my hand to speak, wanting to remind everyone about the practice presentation where only Ella showed up. But the lawyer immediately said I wasn't scheduled to speak yet and couldn't interrupt. The lawyer's words hung in the air while I slowly lowered my hand, feeling my face get hot. The board members looked between me and the lawyer, clearly uncomfortable with how he'd shut me down. Professor Stewart's lawyer just told a witness they can't speak up about the truth, I thought to myself. That's like a firefighter telling water it can't put out flames because it wasn't scheduled to help yet. One of them, an older woman with gray hair, made a note on her paper. "Miss Owens," the board chair said, turning to Isabel, "you're scheduled to speak next. Please tell us about your contributions to the project." Isabel stood up, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands. Her parents sat rigid beside her, their faces tight with worry. She walked to the front and cleared her throat 3 times before speaking. "Ella wouldn't let us help," Isabel started, but her voice wavered. She wanted to control everything and kept saying our ideas weren't good enough. "Can you describe any specific ideas you proposed?" the board chair asked. Isabel's mouth opened and closed. She looked at her parents, then at Gabe, then back at the board. "Well, I suggested we should focus on the marketing aspect. The project was entirely about marketing," Ella said quietly from her seat. "That was the assignment." Isabel's face went red. "I mean specific marketing strategies, like social media." "Which social media platforms?" another board member asked. "What was your proposed strategy?" The silence stretched out. Isabel started talking about Instagram and influencers, but it was clear she had no idea what the actual project was about. She couldn't even name Nike's current sustainability initiatives, which were the whole focus of the project. After 5 painful minutes, she sat back down. her mother whispering furiously in her ear. Hudson's name got called next, but of course, his chair stayed empty. The board chair made another note and said, "Mr. Hudson appears to have chosen not to attend, which speaks for itself." Then it was Gabe's turn. He walked up with this swagger, like he was about to give a TED talk, but I noticed his hands were jammed in his pockets. "This is all a misunderstanding," he started. "Ella insisted on doing everything herself. She's a control freak who wouldn't accept help." The board chair pulled out a paper. "Mr. Stewart, can you explain this text message you sent to Miss Snyder 3 weeks ago? You wrote, quote, 'Don't worry about the grade. My dad will handle it.'" Gabe's swagger disappeared. "That was just a joke. I was trying to calm her down because she was stressing everyone out." "A joke about your father manipulating grades?" "It's not like that," Gabe said, his voice getting higher. "You're taking it out of context. They showed him more messages. Him calling Ella his personal secretary, saying the project was her problem, bragging about not reading any of the research. Each one made him look worse, and his explanations got weaker. For 2 days after the hearing, we waited. Ella couldn't focus on anything else. She'd start reading for other classes, then realize she'd been staring at the same page for 20 minutes. She told me she kept having dreams where everyone decided she was lying, where Gabe somehow convinced them she'd made everything up. "The truth matters," I kept telling her. "They saw the evidence. Sometimes the truth isn't enough," she said, and we both knew she was right. We'd both seen enough to know that. On the third day, Thursday afternoon, I was walking past the library when I saw something that made me stop cold. Professor Stewart had Ella backed against the bike racks outside, talking fast and gesturing with his hands. Even from 50 feet away, I could see Ella trying to step around him and him moving to block her. I pulled out my phone and started recording while walking closer. Another student, someone I didn't recognize, was already calling security. "Please, Ella, just think about what you're doing," Professor Stewart was saying when I got close enough to hear. "I'll give you an A, write you recommendations for any grad school you want. Just tell them you exaggerated, that you were stressed." "You're not supposed to contact me," Ella said, her voice steady, but her hands gripping her backpack straps so tight her knuckles were white. "There's a no-contact order. This is bigger than some bureaucratic rule," he said, and for the first time I saw him as just a desperate man, not a professor. "My family is falling apart. My wife won't talk to me. Gabe's whole future." Security arrived then. 2 officers who recognized the situation immediately. One of them looked at his partner and said, "That's the professor from the complaint." Professor Stewart tried to explain he was just talking to a student, but the security officer was already on his radio. They escorted him away while he kept looking back at Ella, his face a mix of anger and panic. "He just made everything worse for himself," Ella said after they left. She was shaking now that it was over. "Breaking the no-contact order. That's going to destroy any credibility he had left." The next morning, Friday, we got called back for the board's decision. Ella's hands shook as we walked into the same conference room. I grabbed one of her hands and squeezed it, feeling her squeeze back. The board members sat at their table with stacks of papers in front of them. The chair's face gave away nothing as she shuffled through documents. The room was fuller this time. Gabe sat in the back with both his parents now, his mother's eyes red and puffy. Isabel was there with her parents. Hudson's chair still empty. Grace Chavez sat behind Ella, and Dean Shaw stood by the door like he was guarding it. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, the board chair began, and I felt Ella stop breathing beside me. "We find Professor Stewart guilty of academic misconduct, breach of ethical guidelines, attempted bribery of a student employee, and violation of the no-contact order." The room erupted. Gabe jumped up shouting, "This is bullshit." His mother started crying harder. His father tried to pull him back down, but Gabe shoved his hand away. The board chair continued like nothing was happening. "Professor Stewart is suspended immediately pending termination proceedings. Mr. Gabe Stewart receives an F in the course and is placed on academic probation. Miss Owens and Mr. Hudson receive D grades that reflect their lack of participation. Miss Snyder's A grade stands, and the board extends an official apology for the distress caused by this situation." Gabe stormed toward the door, stopping right in front of Ella. "You destroyed my family," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I hope you're happy." His mother followed him out, sobbing. I felt bad for her, even though I knew they'd brought this on themselves. She probably never imagined her family would fall apart over a group project. That evening, the campus paper ran the story online with a headline, "Professor's son received special treatment, investigation reveals." Within an hour, it had over 1,000 shares. Ella's phone buzzed non-stop with messages from other students sharing their own stories, thanking her for standing up, saying she was brave. She turned her phone off and sat in her dorm room in silence. "I don't feel brave," she told me. "I just feel tired." Monday morning, I walked past Professor Stewart's office and saw maintenance workers carrying out boxes. His nameplate was already gone from the door, leaving just 4 small holes in the wood where it had been screwed in. Students stopped to watch and take pictures, like it was some kind of show. When Ella walked by on her way to class, she kept her eyes straight ahead, not looking at the empty office even once. 2 days later, Dylan found me in the dining hall. "Gabe's leaving," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "His parents are making him transfer, but honestly, I think he's just going home. His parents are getting divorced. This was the last straw. His mom found out about other stuff, too." "That's not Ella's fault," I said. "I know," Dylan said, poking at his food. "But Gabe still doesn't think he did anything wrong. Keep saying Ella overreacted. By the end of the week, the whole business department was different. Professors who used to be casual about group projects suddenly had detailed rubrics and check-in requirements. The department chair sent out an email about new policies for disclosing family relationships. They actually called them the Snyder Protocols in the official documentation, which made Ella cringe when she saw it. "I hate that my name is on it," she said, reading the email, "like I'm some kind of symbol now." "You are," I told her. "You're the student who wouldn't let them get away with it." The next Thursday, almost a month after that disastrous first presentation, Ella presented her Nike project again to the substitute professor. She stood at the front of the room in the same professional blazer, but this time, her hands were steady. She delivered all 20 minutes flawlessly. Every slide, every transition, every detail she'd researched alone in that library study room. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then one student started clapping, then another. Soon, most of the class was applauding, and Ella's eyes got watery, but she didn't cry. A few students stayed after to tell her the presentation was amazing, that the research was incredible. I watched her smile, really smile, for the first time in weeks. 3 days later, the university's legal department contacted Ella with a settlement offer. They'd pay her tuition for the rest of undergrad, plus guarantee admission and funding for their graduate program. Her parents drove up again to review the offer, spreading papers across the dorm lounge like they'd done with the evidence before. "It's a good offer," her mother said. "Free education, guaranteed grad school placement. But I'd have to stay here," Ella said, looking at the papers. "I'm not sure I want to be at the place that let this happen for so long." She turned to me. "What do you think?" I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted her to stay, to keep fighting from inside the system, but I also understood why she might want to leave, to start fresh somewhere that didn't remind her of all this. Gabe's mom started crying in the hearing, and honestly, I felt like we needed a support group for parents who just discovered their kids weren't the angels they thought they were. The next week, the new professor offered me the teaching assistant position officially. Not Professor Stewart's old position, they made that very clear, but a new one with better oversight and clearer guidelines. I accepted, thinking about all the students who might need someone to notice when they were carrying their whole group alone. My first action was setting up an anonymous reporting system for group projects. Just a simple online form where students could flag issues early. Within 2 days, I had 3 submissions. That same week, Ella made a decision that surprised everyone except me. She walked into her advisor's office and switched her major from business to law. "I want to help people fight systems like this," she told me afterward. Business was about making money. Law is about making things fair. Her advisor, who'd been following the whole situation, immediately placed her in upper-level courses. "You've already won your first case," he told her. "Most law students don't get that experience until after they graduate." Aisha Weiss, the girl who posted about the confrontation, started something unexpected. She organized a support group for students dealing with unfair treatment from professors. The first meeting was supposed to be small, maybe 5 or 6 people in a study room. 30 students showed up. I went to support Aisha, and the stories I heard were heartbreaking. A girl whose professor gave her a C because she wouldn't go to dinner with him. A guy who failed a class after reporting his professor for using racial slurs. Story after story of power being abused, and students feeling helpless. "What Ella did shows we can fight back," Aisha said. "We just need to support each other." 2 days later, a reporter from the city newspaper called me. They wanted to write about grade favoritism at universities, using our situation as the centerpiece. Ella refused to talk to them. She just wanted to move forward, but she gave them my contact information. "I'll talk," I told the reporter, "but no names. This isn't about making anyone famous. It's about fixing what's broken." The article ran a week later, and suddenly, Professor Stewart's past came flooding out. Former students from years back shared their stories online. One guy showed how his grade jumped from a D to a B after his dad donated to the department. A woman revealed emails where Professor Stewart offered to reconsider her grade if she'd retake his class and pay full tuition instead of using her scholarship. The investigation that had closed reopened, now looking at 6 years of grades. The evidence was overwhelming. One afternoon, Ella and I were getting coffee when we saw Gabe's mother sitting alone at a corner table. She looked older, tired, like she'd aged years in the past month. When she saw us, she stood up and walked over. "I'm sorry," she said to Ella, tears already forming. "I knew something was wrong. Gabe never studied, never worried about grades, and I should have questioned it. I didn't want to see it." "It's not your fault," Ella said, and I could tell she meant it. "You didn't make those choices." They hugged right there in the coffee shop, and Gabe's mother whispered, "Thank you for having the courage I didn't have." The department's new group project rules went into effect immediately. They required weekly progress reports from each member, individual submissions of work completed, and regular check-ins with TAs. Some students complained it was too much oversight, but I noticed the quiet, hard-working students seemed relieved. "We're calling them the Snyder Protocols," the department chair announced in a faculty meeting I had to attend. Ella hated it when I told her. "I don't want my name on anything," she said. "I just wanted to pass my class fairly. The people who make the most trouble are the ones who change things," I reminded her. Finals week arrived with a strange energy. Ella's other professors seemed to grade her extra carefully, probably worried about appearing biased in either direction. She laughed about it, saying she should have exposed corruption earlier if it meant professors would actually read her papers thoroughly. Her grades that semester were the best she'd ever earned, and everyone knew she'd earned them fairly. The semester ended with the business department throwing their end-of-year party in the faculty lounge. They'd invited Ella specially, which surprised both of us since she'd just switched to law. When we walked in together, the department chair immediately steered her toward a small stage they'd set up. "We have something for you," he announced to the room, holding up a glass plaque that looked like they'd ordered it yesterday. The engraving read, "Excellence in Academic Integrity," with Ella's name underneath. Ella took it with a polite smile, thanked everyone, and gave a short speech about hoping the department would continue improving. But afterward, in the hallway, she handed me the plaque. "This feels like they're trying to make themselves feel better," she said. "Like giving me a piece of glass fixes how they ignored everything until I had to scream about it." The next week, the official termination news came out. Professor Stewart lost everything: his job, his pension, his benefits, even his parking spot. The article mentioned severe academic misconduct spanning multiple years. That same day, Gabe posted a long rant online about cancel culture destroying innocent families. He called Ella a vindictive witch who couldn't handle group dynamics. Dylan sent me screenshots adding that Gabe still didn't think he'd done anything wrong. Meanwhile, Ella started getting messages from students everywhere dealing with similar problems. Instead of ignoring them, she spent 3 days writing a detailed guide: what evidence to collect, who to contact, how to document everything. She posted it on a student forum, and within a week, it had been shared hundreds of times. "I can't help everyone personally," she told me. "But maybe this will help someone else stand up sooner than I did." When the spring semester started, everyone knew who Ella was. Walking across campus with her meant constant stares and whispers. Some students treated her like a hero, others, like she was the girl who broke up a family. She kept her head down and focused on her new law classes, especially one called Education Law and Student Rights. "This professor actually wants students to question authority," she told me after the first class, sounding amazed. "He said my case will be required reading next year." 3 weeks into the semester, I noticed something familiar in the papers I was grading. One student, a quiet girl in the back row, had clearly done her entire group's research paper. The writing style changed completely between sections, and her group members' individual assignments were barely coherent. I called her to my office hours and asked directly about the group work. She started crying immediately, saying her group threatened to give her bad peer reviews if she didn't do everything. I documented everything, moved her to a different group, and made sure the original group knew I was watching. When she thanked me with tears in her eyes, I thought about Ella sitting alone in that library every week. In March, Ella called me screaming with excitement. She'd gotten a summer internship at an education advocacy nonprofit, beating out law students from much better schools. The interviewer said my experience with the broken system made me perfect for the job, she said, her voice cracking with happy tears. I understood what students go through because I lived it in May right before finals. Gabe tried to come back for a friend's graduation. Dylan told me Gabe lasted about an hour on campus before leaving. Students had recognized him, and not in a good way. Someone had pointed and said loudly, "That's the professor's son who failed because he was too lazy to show up." Others just stared until he got uncomfortable and left. "He still thinks he's the victim," Dylan said, shaking his head. "Keeps saying Ella ruined his life over nothing." A week later, news broke that the school had quietly settled with Professor Stewart to avoid a wrongful termination lawsuit. He'd never teach again, that was part of the agreement, but he'd get a small payout to go away quietly. "It's not enough," Ella said when she heard, "but at least he can't do this to other students." That summer, they invited me to speak at a teaching conference about academic integrity. They wanted to use our case as a cautionary tale. Ella declined their invitation, saying she was done being a symbol. So, I went alone. I stood in front of 200 professors and told them the simple truth: protecting students should matter more than protecting colleagues. Half the room looked uncomfortable. Good. By August, every law school Ella had applied to accepted her with significant scholarships. She spread the acceptance letters across her dorm room floor, reading each one carefully. Yale, Harvard, Stanford, they all wanted her. "I'm picking Columbia," she told me. "They have the best program for education law reform." Her parents framed the acceptance letter and hung it in their living room, right next to her perfect grade report from that awful semester. In October, Isabel sent Ella a real apology letter, not an email but an actual handwritten letter saying she'd been scared of failing and took the easy path. She was retaking the class, doing the work herself this time. "I accept her apology," Ella told me, "but we'll never be friends." Why did they wait until Ella switched to law to suddenly offer her special recognition and that integrity award? The timing seemed really convenient, like they were trying to look good now that she wasn't their problem anymore. Some things can't be undone. Graduation day came in late May, sunny and perfect. Ella stood at the podium in her cap and gown, chosen to give the student address. She talked about standing up to power, about systems that protect the wrong people, about the courage to say, "This isn't right," even when everyone wants you to stay quiet. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Even the administrators who'd fought her at first stood and clapped, though we both knew their support came too late to mean much. After the ceremony, Ella found me in the crowd of families taking pictures. "Thank you," she said, hugging me tight, "for being my witness, for not taking the bribe, for standing with me when it would have been easier not to." We both had tears in our eyes. The system was still broken, we knew that, but maybe it was a little less broken than before. A year later, I got a message from Ella with a photo attached. She was in a Columbia Law Library, surrounded by case files, working on a lawsuit against another university with similar grade manipulation problems. "This is what I was meant to do," she wrote. "Every case I work on, I think about that semester. It broke me, but it also built me into someone who can break these systems." That same month, the business school announced they were adding a student position to the academic review board, someone with full voting rights who could speak for student interests. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The girl who snapped had ended up changing the structure that had failed her. 14 months after graduation, I stood in front of my own class for the first time, real teaching, not just assisting. On the first day, I told them about what happens when nice people finally snap, though I didn't use names. "Being nice doesn't mean being a doormat," I said, watching them take notes. "Hard work should matter more than connections. And sometimes when someone reaches their breaking point, they don't just break, they break the bad systems around them." One student raised her hand. "Is that story true? About the girl and the professor's son?" I thought about Ella in law school, fighting for other students now. About Professor Stewart, whose name had become a cautionary tale at teaching conferences. About Gabe, who Dylan said still lived at home, still convinced he was the victim. About all the students who'd messaged Ella, saying her story gave them courage to speak up. "The best stories usually are," I told her, and continued with the lesson. Well, folks, that's our show. Appreciate you letting me be your sharp-tongued sidekick through all this. Like the video,